Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns, both big and small. We train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building, and we help leaders craft their own public narrative that tells a story that unites people and moves them to act together. And if you want to create change in your own community in 2023, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn have the experience you need on your side when something goes wrong. They know the law inside and out and will explain every detail without legal jargon so you feel comfortable and fully understand your situation. They know how the system works and have the expertise and resources to continue standing up for clients on matters where others might just give up. To find out more, go to their website, which is mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations and events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners, and to find out more, you can simply go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, which drops every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And home we are today because we are going to be talking to Thomas Costa, who is the Assistant Secretary of Unions New South Wales, which is the peak union body in the state of New South Wales that has all of the, I think it's 60 affiliated unions that are members of Unions New South Wales. He was the lead negotiator in an 18-month-long dispute over their new enterprise agreement with the New South Wales state government, the Conservative state government, on behalf of 6 unions that represent transport workers in Sydney and the wider New South Wales area. It was their enterprise agreement that was up for renegotiation, and it took 18 months to get a new deal from their employer, the government. It's an amazing story, and any trade unionist out there that wants to hear about how they managed to strategize and then have to re-strategize through a Sydney lockdown and COVID and operating under these new conditions of uncertainty. It's an incredible journey, but in the end, it was a positive result, and it's worth sharing with everyone. We really appreciate Thomas coming on the show today to go through that campaign with us all. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast. And when you're done listening to the show, leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all the latest updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And to everyone out there who tuned into our episode with Premier Dan Andrews last week, it's been one of our biggest episodes we've ever had in terms of listenership and downloads. Thank you so much. Thank you for all your positive feedback. Thank you for sharing the episode amongst all of your social network platforms and channels. We really, really appreciate it. And we've obviously got a whole bunch of new listeners that have tuned into Socially Democratic. We want to say welcome to you guys as well. Welcome to our global socially democratic left-wing family, progressive family. This podcast is the place where you can find great stories from people both here in Australia and overseas about the great work they're doing, both organising, broadly speaking, campaigning, a little bit of policy chat, but also people in leadership and power building and wanting to create change. This is the home for you. So we really are glad you've joined us as well. But let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday evening on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And today's episode, we're going to be talking to the lead negotiator for the successful combined rail unions campaign up in New South Wales that came to a positive conclusion late last year after an 18-month-long dispute with the New South Wales state government. and he's joining on the line to unpack this campaign. He is the Unions New South Wales Assistant Secretary, Thomas Costa. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So it's always good to get a unionist on the show to talk about something super positive that had a great outcome. This campaign obviously must have been all-consuming for both you and the union leadership and its members for a long, long period of time. So I really want to use the next hour to really kind of unpack it for folks out there that are either trade unionists that are going through their own campaigns right now, or folks that are obviously progressives that are super interested in hearing some great wins for the trade union movement. Let's begin by talking about who were the people, who was your constituency, who's the community, who were the workers that you were organising? Where do they work? What kind of work did they perform? How many of them are there? That kind of stuff. Talk us through that.
Yeah, sure. I think actually it's quite interesting at this point in time where in sort of federal politics we're talking a lot about multi-employer bargaining and industry-wide bargaining, and really probably the only example of an industry-wide negotiation that exists currently in Australia is Sydney Trains and New South Wales Trains. So our constituents are members who work in the transport network, anything from a cleaner who's cleaning platforms and trains all the way up to train drivers themselves, but people who work on tracks doing maintenance, protection officers who are in the safety of ensuring that workers on the tracks are protected. It's the entire rail industry forms the constituency of the Sydney Trains, New South Wales Trains agreements. It's a large workforce. It's about 13 to 15,000 workers, 13 in Sydney Trains and then an additional couple of thousand in New South Wales Trains. And it involves 6 separate unions who represent all the different types of occupations and classifications across that network. So really, anything you can think of in association with rail, they're covered by this agreement. We've got electricians, we have boilermakers, we have, like I said, drivers, platform staff, customer service operators, protection officers, the people who go around and check tickets, and then all the white-collar people who are involved in rostering and scheduling of the trains and so forth as well.
And of that 16,000 workers, the union density roughly across those 6 unions, how many of those workers were signed up members of their respective union?
Yeah, this is one of the great assets of this negotiation, in that we have probably about 90% density of union membership. It's an extremely high union membership. So that is one of the really good advantages when you're doing this EA, that you have most of the employees signed up.
So you're starting from a position of strength, notionally speaking, anyway. It's not just being a member of unions is going to then, it's not going to be a lay down misere in a campaign, but it certainly is a lot easier than coming from a position where you're less than 50% of the workforce, right?
Oh, definitely. And it does. It saves you one step in a negotiation, in that you don't really need to, and at least we do a little bit of it, because there's that 10% that's sort of hanging around that we try to recruit, but you don't spend a lot of time on recruitment and planning for this type of bargain, because you've got most of the members, and you can start focusing directly on educating and activating those members rather than having to do a big recruitment drive before commencing a negotiation.
In the process of mapping with a campaign and getting a sense of your own constituency, and we'll talk about the opposition in a moment, was there an existing leadership? And when I mean leadership, I don't mean by trade union officials. I'm talking about the leadership of the workforce, like delegate structures. Was there a good, strong delegate structure across all of the different unions that you could actually work with?
Yeah, look, I feel like I'm talking to all the advantages. That there are a lot of disadvantages in this negotiation, but
don't worry, Thomas. We'll get to them eventually for sure.
But yeah, another advantage we do have, and it comes from the fact that this is a really old workplace. Rail's been around for a long time, and the unions have been in there for a long time. So the delegate structures are quite sophisticated. They're quite broad. Our bargaining unit, which is the unit that attends all of the negotiations, is 80 plus officials and delegates. The majority are delegates. And by that, I mean they're workers who do their union role voluntarily. They don't have full-time union positions. They're definitely on the tools. And then we have chains that go all the way down from them to the grassroots membership. So the delegate structure is really quite strong. There's really good email chains, WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, all of those sorts of mechanisms in place that allows us to talk to the members quite quickly and get out accurate information early. But also coming back to what you said about mapping, when we start planning for this negotiation, which usually starts around 6 months before the end of the previous agreement, we are very easily able to find out what the concerns from members are and start to put together our logs and start talking to them about potential strategies that we're going to develop through the negotiation as well.
Were there initial challenges in trying to bring together 6 independent unions and establish, a common goals, a shared purpose? I can't imagine that would be an easy thing. Was there ever any conflicting interests or any of that kind of stuff that you had to sort of deal with early?
It is challenging. You're right. It's probably a little bit easier now than when I first started working in this area, because we've got a bit of a history together and a lot of the officials have experience working with each other across the different unions. But you do have inherent challenges, which is different unions have different classifications of members, and because of that, there are different interests. And then so ensuring that you can align those interests, but also maintain the solidarity amongst the different unions and maintain a single strategy is difficult. That's part of the reason Unions New South Wales is actually involved in this negotiation. Our role predominantly is to coordinate those 6 unions, to bring them together, and to make sure that if we do have conflict or disputes, we're dealing with it as unions behind closed doors and not allowing that to affect the negotiation or jeopardise anyone's interest during those negotiations. We have some very clear principles that we set down at the beginning of planning for the negotiation. We have a memorandum of understanding that all the unions sign up to. One of the principles that has been maintained over a number of years, and something we're really firm about, is that no union will sign off on an agreement until all unions are happy with it. So we don't move forward until every union is happy to move forward. And that can be challenging, especially when one union feels like all their claims have been resolved and they just want to get the EA done, and then there's another union holding out over something that's a bit more difficult. But ultimately that means everyone's looked after, even the weaker groups and members are looked after, and we don't just have a situation where the employers are able to split us and appeal only to the stronger members.
So let's talk about the opposition in this campaign. Who were they, and what kind of relationship had you had with them in the past prior to this round of negotiations?
Yeah, I think it's probably important to talk about just how unique this employer is, because essentially Sydney and New South Wales Trains are state-owned corporations. So they act as corporate entities. When we negotiate, we're technically negotiating with management, with the chief executives of those state-owned corporations. But because it is a government-owned entity and it's run by Transport for New South Wales, we have these other players that come into the negotiation and have a significant influence over how the negotiation goes. And that starts with the Secretary of Transport for New South Wales, but then moves upwards towards the Minister for Transport and ultimately to the Minister for Industrial Relations and the Premier. So when we're developing a strategy for negotiations, we've had to be a little bit aware of how the politics is going to play into the negotiation. And in the past, this I have to say, this EA played out very differently than what we expected. But in the past, what's typically happened is we've started negotiating with the corporation, the corporate entities. We've negotiated the majority of claims, and then on the final sticking points, the minister has stepped in and we've been able to just kind of broker the final deal with the minister at that point. And that's sort of the typical way that it's happened. I'd say over the last sort of 3 to 4 years, the relationship with the government hasn't been good between the unions and the minister and the government. So we were quite wary about that heading into this negotiation, that when we got to that stage of dealing with the politicians, that it was going to get really tricky. And unfortunately, at the start of the negotiation, there was also no one in our bargaining team that had any connection or communication with the minister or the government to know where they were heading with that. So we weren't getting very good intel about where the government was going to head with this negotiation as we went into it. Whereas normally we do have sometimes some communication coming to us from the minister about what their expectation is.
Heading into these negotiations, were your expectations to be? I mean, granted, it's a coalition or a conservative state government, but you've had the state government, unfortunately, in New South Wales for a while. It's been conservative. I'm sure you've had other negotiations in the past with them. Did you enter into those negotiations with the expectation that, you'd have a log of claims, you'd have to bargain, some things would come off, some things you would win, but primarily you should be able to wrap this up within a nice time frame for the workers to be delivered, new wage increases and hopefully strengthened conditions in their multiple EBAs or one EBA or whatever it may be?
Yeah, look, I think naively we did. We probably shouldn't have thought that, but I think naively we thought this will be a fairly straightforward negotiation. It might be tough. There'll probably be industrial action. There'll probably be some political interference, but ultimately it will play out like a straightforward negotiation. We will start bargaining. We'll negotiate a number of our claims. We'll get to the sticking points on these major items. The minister will intervene and we will sort those out with the minister, and then we will sign off on an agreement. I probably didn't think it would happen within 6 months, but definitely thought we would be well on our way to signing off and having an agreement voted up by the sort of 10 to 11 month mark.
Broadly speaking, what was the claims on behalf of the 6 unions? What were you looking for in this new round of negotiations?
Yeah, so we had 150 claims, which sounds like a lot but remember, it's a very large workforce. So lots of different classifications. There's quite a few unions. So it's not as big as it sounds. Typically, though, it was still bigger than a typical Sydney Trains, New South Wales Trains negotiation. Typically, we have about 30 claims, so it was larger. But of those claims, there was probably about 18 to 20 major claims. And they included things, well, the number one thing was safety, and it concerned a new train that Transport for New South Wales had been trying to introduce onto the network for about 6 years. Our concern was that train was not safe for passengers and it needed modifications before it would be safe. And so one of our major claims was to have that train modified to include those safety measures before our members had to work on it or drive it, because our members were quite adamant that they would not operate a train that they believed was unsafe to the public. So that was the very big sort of major claim sitting there. But then underneath that was a number of other things that concerned the operation of the previous agreement, which had caused a lot of frustration for members. And that was things like a disciplinary clause that allowed people to be suspended for 12 months from work without being told why, which was leading to really stressful, in some cases, quite dangerous situations where people were becoming really uncertain about what's happening with their employment. And they were suspended effectively on reduced pay because they were suspended on a base rate. They don't get their allowances. And so that was putting people in a really stressful position. We wanted to fix that. Again, rostering was a problem. There was a lot of problems with how people were being rostered without very clear notice of what their rostering would be, from changing sort of pattern of work from day to day and week to week. We wanted to fix the process around how that sort of worked. Another major item for all the unions and all the members was our redundancy conditions. Effectively, the employers had come to the initial bargain and said that they wanted to remove all of our redundancy provisions that were additional to the rest of the public sector and put us onto the base level. That would have essentially reduced people's redundancy entitlements by about 2/3. And because of the concern constantly in transport, particularly in a public-owned transport company, of privatisation, employers are always very hyper-aware and move to reduce their redundancy conditions. They see that as the first sign that there will be privatisation. So we wanted to preserve their redundancy entitlements. That was a major claim for us as well. And then probably the last really significant claim was 20 days paid family domestic violence leave. And we were seeking this claim well before the change in federal government and the change in federal government position on this. But that was something we wanted to ensure that these members were entitled to. In the previous EA, Sydney Trains had been the first public sector employer to bring in paid domestic violence leave, but it was only 7 days. The world had moved on from then. We know that we needed a little bit more, and so we were seeking 20 days paid domestic and family violence leave.
So you've got this substantial log of claims, and you go in and meet with the company, their log of claims. Were they asking for a similar type of list, or were they just in there saying no to yours? Talk us through what they wanted out of this negotiation.
Yeah, so we've gone through our 6 months planning process. We've educated our members in the EA. We talked to our delegates. We were ready to bargain. We had our subject matter experts all ready to articulate our claims. We get to our first meeting with the employers and they say, look, we don't want to negotiate anything. We want to vary the agreement and extend it for 6 months, and we'll give you a 0.3% pay rise. And that completely caught us off guard because, like I've said to you, we have quite an extensive membership. We speak to our members. We know what they want. So we just sort of looked at them and said, well, there's no way this is going to get voted up. There's just no way. Why are we even discussing it? It's going to be a waste of time. And they stared us down and said, no, we think we know your members better than you do. We're going to persist with this variation. We're not going to negotiate with you any further. We're going out with a variation. We're going to take it out to the membership. And they did that. They delayed our negotiation probably by about 2 to 3 months by going through this process. It was knocked over overwhelmingly no vote. It was about, I think it was a 96% no vote, as you would expect. That there was no way our members were going to accept essentially a 0% pay increase to their wages and cop the same conditions that they wanted to reform. But that was the first sort of move by the employers in the negotiation. And that's the first point where we realised this was going to be a far more aggressive negotiation than we had expected.
I love the twist in the story that comes early in the second act straight away. It catches everyone off by surprise. What do you think lay behind this strategy or this position from the government or from the company about rolling over the agreement and offering such a pissant wage increase?
I think a number of things. I think the government had gone out to the public sector, and that's what they had given the rest of the public sector, a 0.3% pay increase, which was quite shocking. And they could do that because most of the public sector in New South Wales is not employed in the federal system. They don't have the same rights to bargain and to take industrial action that private employees of private companies do. And in Sydney Trains and New South Wales Trains, because it's a state-owned corporation, they do have the same rights as employees of private companies. So I think that was part of it. They wanted to be consistent with government, and they were going to use this as a way to try and, as an excuse to try and pressure us. I think the other thing was they had a strategy, and this evolved over the next couple of months of bargaining. It became very clear. They had a strategy of delay and surface bargain. And I think that strategy was partially they wanted to stress our members to a point where they would be willing to accept a lesser offer than what they were seeking, because the longer negotiations go on, the longer our members are without a pay rise. And I think also, having looking at it now through looking backwards at the entire negotiation, I think there was a clear strategy to try and move us into the territory of terminating the enterprise agreement. So the longer they could negotiate with us, surface bargain with us, and show that there hadn't been much progress, the better chance they would have been to go to the Fair Work Commission and say, oh, we don't think there's any value in negotiating any further. We want the EA terminated and we want to move these employees onto the award, which would have seen them lose about 30 to 40% of their pay and entitlements.
Thomas, that term you just used, I'm not familiar with that. Surface bargaining, just explain that to us.
Yeah, so what I mean by that is, they would turn up to meetings, particularly during the second COVID lockdown when the meetings were online, and they would talk around claims, or they would ask a lot of questions about our claims, but they showed no intention to actually engage with the claim in any real form. So if you picture yourself going in to negotiate a term of your contract with your employer, you have a meeting with them, you talk to them for about an hour, the meeting ends, you schedule a follow-up meeting. When you come to the follow-up meeting, you have exactly the same discussion again for an hour, but yet at no point has your employer said, I'm going to give you a pay rise or not. So they weren't making decisions about any of the claims that we were putting forward. They were just meeting, nodding, asking a lot of questions, sometimes intentionally trying to antagonise delegates, like manipulating the format, because, like I said, we've had 80 or so delegates in the bargaining room for a good period of that lockdown. We were doing it online. So we would have managers just call out random delegates and start asking them questions directly rather than going through the lead negotiators, as a way to just try and disrupt the process, slow it down, antagonise us.
Paint a picture of the room for us. How many are there on the management side sitting in those negotiations? How many are there on the workers' side?
So on the management side, there's about 20 representatives of management, and that's everyone from the chief executives, some representatives from Transport for New South Wales who seem to be in charge of their negotiation strategy. They have lawyers in the room. They have a number of media and comms people that I assume are there sort of preparing their comms to go out to their employees at the end of each meeting, but also for their note keeping. There's a number of people on their side that just never talk. We've been in, I think we had about 500 hours of meetings by the end of it. And there's probably 10 or so people from management that I never heard speak once. They're just sitting there, so I'm not sure what their role is. But on our side, there's roughly 80 of us. There's probably about 10 union officials, like that's paid employed union officials from the 6 different unions, each union sending about 1 or 2 paid employees, depending on the size of the union's representation. And then the rest are delegates of ours. And those delegates who attend the bargaining are our senior delegates. Most of them are subject matter experts that we can call on to speak specifically to different claims. And so, for the most part, it's not all 80 people talking every meeting. It's generally myself and then maybe a couple of other union officials, and then whoever is the subject matter expert delegate at that point in time is also going to speak in that meeting. And we planned how we would do that structure before we even started bargaining. So we had planned what claims we wanted to talk about in which week of bargaining, who those speakers should be, which union should speak to those claims, and then could have quite a disciplined process going through, because there was a lot of work to get through and you want to make sure you're using your time most effectively.
So you've got this negotiating strategy. You guys are clearly well organised. As you said, you've gone through a lot of meticulous planning and preparation, and you go into these meetings and then they hit you in the very first one and say, no, we don't want to do that. We just want to roll this over. Can you remember the moment, and then all of a sudden they start this surface bargaining, which is basically, piss in your pocket. Can you recall the moment when you as a group realised, this is not business as usual, this is not going to go down the way that we first foresaw? And what was your first step? What did you start to do to re-strategize?
So I think when they did the variation strategy, I think our initial reaction is these guys are incompetent, don't know what they're talking about. We'll just knock that over with a no vote and it'll be back to bargaining as normal. I don't think we really felt this is a sign that they're trying something different or they're going to be more aggressive. It just seemed like incompetence. And so we came out of the sort of successful no vote of that feeling quite strong that we'd shown them. Obviously, the members listened to us. Over 90% have voted against your proposal. Now it's time to listen to us. Let's sit down and negotiate. Once we got into the meetings online, though, I think that's the point where the light bulb went off and we realised this is starting to fall apart. I'm grateful to your comment saying we're really well organised, but at that point, we weren't as well organised as we should have been. We had never foreseen bargaining online, and no one had any experience having done bargaining online, particularly with a group this size. So that caught us off guard, and I think we lost a few weeks scrambling, trying to figure out what was happening. The employees divided the meetings into 2 days a week. There were different people invited to different meetings. They were asking questions randomly of different delegates and not focusing on who was meant to be talking. Time was getting away from us, and at that point, we pulled it in as a caucus, and we had to think, wow, we needed a strategy to deal with Zoom meetings, basically. Like we needed a strategy for the technology, and we worked on one, and it wasn't the perfect strategy by any means, but it worked for us, and it just became we had to be even more disciplined than what we thought we were before. We set up a WhatsApp group in which every single bargaining delegate was put into that group. No one was allowed to talk without first either being on the run sheet, which we would go through in caucus in the morning before the meeting. So we would meet with our delegates and officials, probably 9 o'clock in the morning, spend an hour with them, go through our run sheet of what we wanted to talk about, who was going to speak to each claim, and then we would enter into the meeting. And if someone on our side thought, I've got a really good point I want to raise, rather than just jumping in on the Zoom, which would then start to confuse things, they had to go through the WhatsApp group. We would then approve it. Lead negotiator, who was me or one of the other officials, if they were taking over at that point in time, would then call on them to speak, and then we would close it. And that way we started to become really disciplined about how the meetings went through. And other than that, we wouldn't talk unless we had been notified to do it. That once we started doing that, the employees started to get really frustrated, like extremely frustrated. So much so that we realised that this must have been a strategy by theirs to waste time, because we would start getting through things much quicker, and they would start calling on different people just randomly, just saying, hey, Joe, can you give us your opinion on this claim or whatever? And the delegate would say, I'm not talking to this. It's not my turn to speak. The negotiator is talking this item. And at that point, they would start to, well, why aren't you talking? They get really aggressive and start really pushing. At one point, they were accusing delegates of chewing gum while they were sitting on the Zoom screen. It was all like some fairly petty, childish stuff started to happen. So from our perspective, we felt like we'd regained control of the negotiating room at that point.
That's fantastic. I'm just thinking, initially, when was this? At what point in the COVID 2-year black hole was this, particularly because in New South Wales, the experience is different in Victoria? I mean, we felt like we're always in lockdown, but when was this, when did this happen at this particular moment where you all jumped on Zoom?
So this is mid-2021. So the first lockdowns of 2020. In Sydney, we start to go into our second lockdowns mid-2021. Okay. So we'd started negotiating around May 2021. That's when we sort of started really talking to them. And then I think by about June, we're in lockdown again. And while we're in that lockdown period, we started doing these meetings online. And so that's where this frustration builds for about probably 2 months of us going through this process.
And talking about operating in conditions of uncertainty, when you're on Zoom, you've never done this before, you've got a huge group of people to coordinate. There's some things you really can't control on Zoom, like the company could message directly your delegates as well. Like there's a lot of things could be happening below the surface you're not aware of.
Good that you point that out, because the other thing we had to do was stop people using the chat on Zoom and Teams, because none of us, not even myself, I don't want to just say our members and delegates, none of us had negotiated using Teams and Zoom. So people were just putting things into the chat, like, oh, this is wrong, or that's right, or good point. Some of it seemingly innocuous, but private messages that should have just been kept to our caucus that shouldn't be exposed to the employer, and also the risk that the employer is getting the transcript of this printed out at the end of each day. That could pose a risk further on down the track if there's litigation or something. So we had to bring in rules about not using any of the chat forums or anything that were being provided by the employer. We inserted that we wanted the conversations to be confidential, and so no transcripts going out to staff afterwards. But yeah, it was tricky. It's also tricky negotiating from your bedroom as well, and not sort of being able to say, like, oh, look, let's just call time out and go have a coffee and talk to one or two people. Like, each time we call time out, you're talking to your entire 80 delegates at any point in time. There's no way of, these are the kind of, I think, ad hoc things you don't think about in a normal negotiation, but you might say, pause the negotiation, step out of the room and just walk over to one or two delegates or one or two officials and say, oh, mate, on this point, can you jump in on this? Or what do you think about this? Each time we call time out, you're in a caucus with 80 people, so it takes a lot longer. You've got to talk to everyone, and then everyone brings in different opinions. So just working out ways through that was tricky. And then I suppose the other thing that's in the background when you're online is, while you're in lockdown, there's not much point taking industrial action. No one's catching the trains. And we didn't know how long we were going to be in lockdown. And so as we were getting more into the negotiation and our members were getting more agitated about the progress and the surface bargaining, the fear in the back of my mind is we had an industrial action strategy and an escalation plan that was meant to sort of come into effect when certain milestones weren't being met. And yet there was no point in us bringing that out, because just stop the trains, nobody's on the trains. All that happens is your members don't get paid. So that was also another thing kind of playing in the back of our minds, like, what are we going to do if this lockdown continues for a really long period of time? We were still operating the network. There were a few people still catching the trains, so the network hadn't been shut down, but it wasn't going to have the impact that it needed to if we were going to try and pressure the government for a better deal.
So as the negotiations continue on, you're in lockdown, you're operating under this sort of new condition. My next question actually is about relationships, because just like after a negotiation meeting and you'll go out and have a dart and have a bit of a chat with each other, those incidental but intentional moments are important for you as a negotiator and as a party official, or as a union official, or as an organiser with your people, to see how we're going, how are they feeling. But when you're in lockdown, as you said, you're all in isolation in your own homes. How did the 6 unions manage to maintain building strong relationships, good communication norms with not just the 80 delegates that are in the room, air quotes, but also then out into the workforce as well?
I don't think we really got those really close relationships till we came out of lockdown. So there was obviously a lot of phone calls all through the week. The officials were calling each other, discussing how the meetings had gone, what we could do better. And then those officials would be calling delegates. And we had the WhatsApp group, which I think helped start to build a bit of bond between delegates, especially ones from different unions, because they were now in the same group and they were talking to each other. And you could see when a subject matter expert was talking to a certain claim, people would jump on and say, good job. There was a lot of support coming through that, which I think was helpful. But I didn't feel really that kind of strong relationship with my delegates until we started to get back into the room together. In fact, I can remember, and this could also just be having been in lockdown for a couple of months, and so you're a bit socially awkward when you haven't spoken to people or been in a group environment. But I can remember coming into our first negotiating live meeting after the lockdowns and actually feeling a bit nervous talking to my group of delegates in a physical space, because now I've got 80 people in front of me. I'm looking in all different directions because I'm not looking at a screen.
And you're not in your pajamas either.
Not in my, exactly, not in my tracky dacks while I'm doing it. So, I can remember that quite vividly. Obviously, like very quickly, once we're in the room together, those bonds were built really quickly. And the camaraderie within the first 2 weeks of the physical meetings, I think it was a really tight group. And there were moments in that it was an intensive negotiation pretty early once we came out of the lockdown, where we spent 2 weeks every day bargaining. And I can remember the final meeting and doing the final debrief of that intensive, and every delegate got up to talk about the solidarity of the group, what the rest of the group meant to them. And that was a really powerful moment actually for me in the negotiation. At that point is when I really, really believed that there was no way we could lose, because just the commitment to each other was really strong.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get. So the company have clearly got this strategy and they're dragging it out. And now you're in lockdown. You're negotiating on Zoom. Talk to me about how you guys re-strategize. What were because obviously, you already flagged that you'd had planned to do some form of industrial action. Can't do that because you're all on lockdown. What was the thought process in terms of, and I guess thinking about a power analysis, identifying what resources you have and how can you use them to leverage to create the change you're seeking? What did you do as a group to start to re-strategize now?
Yeah, so we were getting a lot of pressure from our members and from the delegates and the bargaining delegates about what could be done in this situation, because we would have our debrief and some of the more vocal delegates would just be, what are we doing? This is going nowhere. The members don't know what's happening. Why is this taking so long? And there was a lot of anger towards the employer, but we were also at risk of that anger starting to be directed towards the unions and the delegates themselves and start to take responsibility for what was happening. And so we really did sort of have to sit down and look at our original strategy. And our original strategy had a very clear escalation plan for industrial action. So if things didn't happen by a certain time, we would start the process to get ballots and everything in order to approve industrial action, and then start taking different types of industrial action, and they were linked to different types of milestones through the EA. We had to pull that back up and say, okay, well, what can we salvage from this to try and put pressure on management, even though we're no longer going to have the same impact as if we were operating the network at full capacity. And what we did was we thought, well, we firstly, we need to just get the protected action ballots and all that process out of the way. So as soon as this lockdown ends, we're ready to go full steam if we need to. So we put in our ballots and started getting that process in. The second thing we did was start to look through our escalation strategy and start picking out the things that would still have an impact on management, even though the network wasn't operating in the normal way. And so that included some different types of industrial action that we didn't used to focus on as much in the past. Things like, we had our people in the white collar section who handle complaints about services. They started changing all of their email signatures to talk about what was going on in bargaining. Everyone was told not to wear uniform, to wear union shirts. So there would be this very visible display to management of support for the union and for the campaign. We had technology bans, which meant an employee, if they were asked to use any form of technology, could refuse to use it. And that didn't mean that they had to refuse to use it all the time. That meant they could do it selectively. And so we would have a situation where employees, if they didn't like a certain type of work, if it involved a phone or a computer or something, they would just say, no, we're not doing it. And so those things, little things like that we knew would irritate management a lot and make things a little bit difficult as we were starting to come out. Fortunately, because we had gone through that process, once the lockdowns ended, we were able to escalate really quickly into overtime bans, which then started to have a really strong impact on the government's plan to try and move everyone back to normal working and to get people back into the city. So as we were coming out of lockdown, the fact that we didn't have to wait, a couple of weeks to go through the balloting process and so forth to get everything in line, we had those ducks in a row. It worked out for us, fortunately. But that was a risk. We didn't know how long the lockdown was going to last. So,
when did you feel the shift in power from the government to the workers?
The moment the lockdown ended. Right. So the moment the lockdown, and it shifted back at different times, but the moment the lockdown ended, the government in New South Wales was coming out with very strong rhetoric about, we want people back in the city, we want people back on transport. That was a very sort of popular language by the Premier at the time, and this unique position where we already had our industrial action approved by the Commission, and we started to put on the overtime bans and start to ratchet it up. And everything in transport in Sydney gets a lot of media attention. So as soon as we started doing a little bit of that, the media was onto it. They started talking about our claims. The media was particularly interested in our major claim because it was about safety and safety of passengers. And so we were able to just get that message out there really clearly on the hook of the overtime bans. And almost immediately, I was getting phone calls from the Secretary and then from the Transport Minister saying, what do we need to do? Like, what can we do to make this stop? And so that's where I felt, that was the first point where I thought, we're onto something here. The plan is working. We just need to stick with our strategy and we're going to get there. But that it felt like that at that moment. At other moments further down the track, it seemed to go the other way. But at that point in time, coming out of those lockdowns, it felt very positive for us.
And coming out of those lockdowns, from memory, that's sort of September, October 2021, right? And this campaign didn't come to a resolution until November last year. Yeah. So there's still another 12 months to go. But you're now getting the Secretary and other people within government on the telephone. So you've now started to get to the real decision makers. What happened in that 12-month period?
So
that got you to the climax.
At that point in time, when they first picked up the phone to us and said, they said all the right things. What's the problem? We raised the issues of surface bargaining. We're not getting anywhere. We're wasting our time. We just want to negotiate properly. We don't think we're that far apart. We'd like to have an intensive period to make up for the fact that we wasted all this time in lockdown. They agreed to that. They brought in a new chief executive, brand new. They got rid of the last one. There were certain negotiators that they were using that we said we didn't want to negotiate with anymore because they had been antagonising and attacking delegates personally. We didn't think that the relationship of trust between us and them was good enough to achieve an agreement, so they removed them. And we had this very, I thought, quite productive first week of intensive bargaining. We articulated our claims quite well. It looked like they were listening. The second week wasn't as productive, but it was still good. We moved on a number of our sort of smaller claims, and one of our strategies had been to try and resolve small claims before we got to big claims. So it's a fairly straightforward strategy, but the point is that if you solve the big things, 90% of your members are going to vote the EA up on those big things, and then the 10% who need those little things miss out. So you want to get them out of the way first. We moved quite considerably on a number of the smaller claims. And then we came out of that intensive bargaining and things started to fall over again. And that's when I think at that point, prior to the intensive bargaining, I think government actually had a strategy at that point. They'd seen what we could do. They could see the discipline of the members. They saw the industrial action and the negative media, and they had decided they wanted this to go away. They were trying to solve it, and we were well on our way to getting it done. And then as we got towards the end of the year, I think probably government's position shifted to, actually, there might be a win for government if we antagonise the unions and we push them into more industrial action and we turn this into a political fight. Because the same pattern repeated itself about 3 or 4 times where we would agree to something, they would come back a week later and say, no, we never agreed to that. Expect us to take industrial action, and then go to the media and say, oh, look at this big bad union who's inconveniencing the public. And so I think that was a deliberate strategy for them. That led to, I think, why it took so much longer, because we got caught up in this, what essentially was a political fight rather than just a straightforward negotiation.
Remind me, who was the Premier in New South Wales at that moment?
It's Perrottet. At that point in time, Perrottet is the Premier. I'm pretty sure it was Perrottet. But we had, at the end of 2021, so we dealt with about 6 different ministers in this, which was also another problem. We started off with Andrew Constance at the beginning of negotiations. Then we had Rob Stokes for a little bit, and Rob Stokes was the one that agreed to the intensive bargaining, who I think his view was, let's just try and get this resolved as quickly as possible. The union's claims make sense for the most part. They weren't going to agree to everything, but they were willing to talk to us about modifying the unsafe train and our major claims. And then Stokes moves portfolio, and we have Minister Elliott is involved. He doesn't meet us for a long while, until after Christmas. And we start dealing with him. And then later on down the track, we start to see the Minister for Industrial Relations gets involved, Natalie Ward, another minister, gets involved, and things start to get a little bit trickier as well.
Whilst this is going on over the period of last year, as we're sort of getting closer to November, how are you keeping your members tight on this issue? Because this is going on for a while now, right? So
the most important thing in an EA of this size, when you've got this many members, is you've got to have so much communication. The more communication, the better. I was told when I first started negotiating rail agreements that you want to be communicating with your members so much that they tell you to stop telling us stuff. Like, you just keep bombarding them with comms. So one of the reasons we would have a debrief at the end of each EA meeting wasn't just to get everyone's views on what had happened and how the day had went. It was also to write up our comms. And I wanted to make sure that everyone had input on that and that we could put that together and then distribute it to people straight away. Because if we left it for a day, it starts to become stale. And then, by the time you get it out to the members, the employers already put out their comms to staff. So we aim to have comms to members the same night of each bargaining meeting. And if that meant if we had 5 bargaining meetings that week, we would have 5 communications out to them that week. And we would just summarise everything that was happening. We tried to keep the language very neutral. I think it's patronising to put out kind of rhetorical information to members about how bad the employer is, and they did this and that. I think members can figure it out for themselves when we just talk to them directly to the facts. And they've got their delegates to find out about all of that anyway. So what they needed from us is, this is the position we put, this is what they've said, this is what we're going to try and do, these are the things that you can do. And we would have, you know, links to different websites where we're posting things all the time, social media things. We were running some social media campaigns in the background that we were trying to get members involved in as well. So we were giving them things that they could also do, support the campaign, but also trying to make sure they were completely abreast of what was happening. Probably, you know, it's sad to think, but probably an advantage that we had was these members had been really badly treated for the past 3 years. There'd been a real campaign by management of bullying and harassment, and which was why one of our major claims was to resolve the disciplinary clause and how people were being treated under that clause. Because of that behaviour, there wasn't a lot of trust from management from our members. They definitely trusted their union a lot more. And so that meant when we were communicating with them, they were looking to our communications for an accurate recollection of what was happening.
Communication goes both ways. Did you have processes or channels by which the membership could then funnel back to you guys how they were feeling, or their concerns or interests or whatnot?
Yeah, and it wasn't always positive, because sometimes in those kinds of strategies that you have, not necessarily the majority voice, but the loudest voice definitely comes through. There was a lot of anti-vaxxer stuff coming through at some points, because we were right through this lockdown period, the COVID period. So we ended up polling our members, and we found that's a very, very small minority, but it was quite loud through our channels about that we should have things in the EA around vaccinations and things like that. But then also, you know, we got good feedback. We obviously got considerable negative feedback when members thought we were doing the wrong thing. Often our negative feedback was, we need to take more industrial action. That was often what our members were saying to us, which I take as a really good sign, because that means I know when we do need to take industrial action, there's going to be a lot of support for it. And, you know, in some other negotiations, that's actually a hard thing to do, to get your members to take industrial action. So knowing that you've got quite a militant workforce, or a workforce that's quite ready to participate in industrial action, is a strength. And that we just needed to, you know, explain to those members that industrial action was going to happen, but it was going to happen on our timeline, not the government's timeline, because it did seem like at some points during the negotiation, government was trying to bait us into industrial action. You know, their behaviour was deliberately antagonistic to try and force us into doing things that could have jeopardised how we appeared in the media, how we appeared to the community, and wouldn't have helped us in the negotiation.
You mentioned before that you used the media as a resource for your campaign in a positive way to frame your campaign up to the wider public. Are there other resources outside of strictly the constituency, the workforce, and the unions to leverage or build power to try and get some breakthroughs? What other things did you try and do over that period of time? Yeah,
well, because it's public transport, there's obviously the political dimension. So, the government is involved, and pressuring the government's important. And there's also the fact that the community uses public transport and is quite invested in how public transport is run. So that meant, in terms of the media, we wanted to use media to try and communicate to those stakeholders, to the community, about what we were doing and why we're doing it, and then vicariously put pressure on government to support our claims. But that also meant we wanted a strategy to deal directly with community as well. So we used a number of social media campaign tools in order to do that. We couldn't do sort of traditional type things during the lockdown period. Other things that we would have normally do was hand out leaflets on trains, do announcements on trains. And we did start doing that once we came out of lockdown. So the drivers would make announcements on the trains to passengers about why there was industrial action ongoing and what the dispute was about. But probably more effective was we started doing a number of online social media campaigns, leveraging off the interest that everyone has in public transport, and then using it to get them to sign up to get updates about what was happening in rail. And we would then explain what this dispute was about, why this, the unions were so concerned about the safety of the public, and then getting the community to sign up on that and mapping out where they were in terms of marginal seats or government seats, and running email campaigns off that. So making sure that marginal MPs knew this was a really important issue to their constituents, and then also government MPs knew it was a really important issue as well.
Did you find that the attitude towards the workforce from the wider public had shifted in a far more positive light after COVID? I just felt that certainly after COVID, I think that the community has a greater respect for our health workers. I think they have a greater respect for retail workers and people working. It's like essentially that essential workforce that had to keep going to work every day while the rest of us sat in our knowledge economy jobs at our desks at home. Coming out of COVID, did you notice that there was a shift in attitude towards the members, and therefore you probably got a little bit more license to do more things in terms of using those resources, withdrawing your labour, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think that's right. I felt that way, whether it's true or not. Definitely, I felt the media was giving us a softer run than they had in the past. They were more open to listen to our side of the story, whereas in previous negotiations, they would often just run the government side and kind of give us lip service in terms of our version. But they were definitely more open to it. One line that I think came through a lot during this negotiation that we tried to get out there as much as possible was there had been, during the lockdowns, there had been very serious discussions with Transport for New South Wales about shutting down the transport network because of the risk that COVID played to people working on the network. And the unions had actually said, and our members also had agreed to this, we actually think we should keep the network running for those people who will need it. Someone who doesn't drive or doesn't have the ability of other transport, who needs to get to a hospital, needs to get somewhere during that period, we need to keep the transport network running. And so the unions had worked with the government to keep that network open at risk to their own members. And the members accepted that risk as well for those reasons. And I think that resonated with the public when our members were out there saying, like, I turned up to work with all this extra PPE. Our cleaners particularly had to do all this additional cleaning, keep the train safe, using all sorts of harsh chemicals, which became a story that ran during the campaign quite a bit. And articulating, I think the public was quite sympathetic to that because they could see these workers have worked all through the COVID period. They hadn't had a break off. They didn't get to work from home. They took considerable risk at a time when we didn't know how dangerous COVID was, and when no one was vaccinated. And the first offer the government had given to them, which it stuck to for the first 10 or so months of negotiations, was a 0.3% pay rise. I think the public sympathised with that. Later on in the negotiations, we started doing our own polling to try and figure out where the public was. And what we found from the polling was they didn't necessarily support unions. They didn't necessarily support us as the union officials, but they definitely supported the workers. And their view was if a number of unions were complaining about the government, something must be wrong with the government. But if one union was complaining, they weren't quite sure. But wherever they heard workers' voices, they were on board and supportive. And so we had to make this as much as possible the workers' voices rather than sort of union officials.
Well, that was my follow-up question, was in terms of the stories of the workers and their experiences, the narrative of it. How central was that for your campaign?
Huge. It was huge. And we, as soon as we came out of lockdown, when we were in our intensive bargaining period, we filmed stories with almost all of our delegates within a couple of days that we could put up on social media. So each delegate being able to tell their own story, having worked through COVID, in their particular role, whether it was as a cleaner or station staff or as a driver, and what that had meant for them and why they were involved in the negotiation and why they supported the union claims.
Take us to the finish line when you get the result. What happened just before that enabled you to finally get a breakthrough?
So we had a pretty dramatic run right before the EA ended, where the Minister for Transport, David Elliott, walked into a meeting that we were having and said, there will not be any more negotiations if you do not accept our offer, and their offer didn't include fixing the train. We're going to terminate the enterprise agreement. And at that point, we were like, okay, that's pretty dramatic. So we scrambled, we filed a good faith bargaining case, we moved to a bit of a litigation strategy within 24 hours. And then we did as much media as we possibly can about what was going on. We escalated our industrial action quite seriously, but not enough to actually shut the network down so that we weren't harming the public. We did as much as we could to harm management. And as we approached sort of November, the government capitulated. They called for meetings. They wanted those meetings supervised by the Fair Work Commission. We would attend those meetings, and they just very quickly started giving us stuff and agreeing to things rapidly. So we started to therefore escalate as much as we could in terms of all our other pressure points to try and bring it to a head. And then on the last day of what became the last day of negotiations, the final sticking point became, what's the wage claim? They'd agreed to fix the train. They agreed to all the other major claims. They were refusing to move off the government's wages policy, except to offer our members an additional $4,500 payment, which was a lot higher than what the rest of the public service had received. And so we came up with a compromise position where we said to them, well, you're telling us that this is fair. You're 3% for the first year and 3.5% for the second year is fair. Why don't you give us that pay rise? And then we apply to the Fair Work Commission to determine whether we deserve an additional pay rise on top of that. Right? That way, you don't have to breach your wages policy without someone else looking at it. And we can go to our members and say, there's going to be an independent third party who's going to look at this claim and see whether we can receive some more money. And they agreed to that. It worked for them. So that was the kind of final moment in it. And then we agreed to withdraw our industrial action on that basis, and we're moving towards a vote now.
And you're doing the vote right now?
The vote is they're doing the road shows to advertise the EA and talk to questions with the members at the moment. They'll move to a vote quite soon, and the Fair Work Commission is in the process of the hearings to hear whether the members deserve something more than what they've already received as well.
That's remarkable. It's unbelievable. Talk us through, I don't know if you've had a chance to reflect on the campaign, but I want to get a sense from you in terms of some pluses and some deltas or some key takeaways. Your time again, what were some of the challenges, or what would you do differently with the benefit of hindsight?
I think this is probably something you say at the end of every negotiation, but I think we need to prepare more than we did. And we did prepare a lot, but there were things that through this one, I think we could have prepared more earlier on. So for example, we had 150 claims. At one point during the negotiation, we decided it would be a good tactic to serve the employer with an entire EA that reflected all of our claims, including all drafted clauses. But we hadn't drafted those clauses at that point in time. So we were scrambling to get 150 clauses drafted within a couple of days, which was a huge mammoth exercise. And I'm very grateful to all of our industrial officers who did that and put that together. In hindsight, I think it probably would have been better to have that before we started negotiating, having every claim drafted, just so that when we were talking to the claims, we were talking to a very clear clause. So that, I think that would have helped. I know that's quite technical, but having those things done before you start negotiation frees you up to actually focus on more of the kind of the unknowns when you're in the negotiation. So I think we could have prepared a little bit more. I think, we probably couldn't have prepared for what happened with the politics, because it just happened, it evolved so quickly and so uniquely in a way. But next time round, I will prepare for these types of scenarios. Just, what happens if the minister changes? Where's the pressure points for different politicians that we might have to deal with? How do we work through those things as well?
And in terms of a couple of key learnings, that if you could just crystallise that and then give that to other unionists out there in terms of the work that they're doing, what were some of the learnings for you guys on this journey?
So one thing for me that really stood out all the way through was, when I was being trained as a negotiator and I was learning negotiating skills, there were certain tropes that you were told, and you just do them, but you don't know whether they're effective or not, right? And in this EA, I actually found out why you do these things. For example, you're always told, be ambitious with your claims, always be ambitious. That will motivate your members and that will get you more buy-in and it will push the employer. Fine, that's fine. I never saw that play out as well as what I saw in this EA. We started out this EA when our major claim was we wanted the government to modify a train. The cost the government was saying that was going to be was $1.3 billion. We're asking a government through an EA negotiation to fix a train that they think is safe. It's not safe. We know it's not safe, but they think it's safe and have told the public for 6 years that it's safe. That's an incredibly ambitious claim. And ultimately, we got them there by just holding the line, motivating our members, making sure our members knew why that was so important, and then going out and educating the community as well, and just applying that pressure. So being ambitious, having 150 claims, pretty ambitious. I don't recommend it. It's a logistical nightmare. But again, it worked. Like, there were a number of claims in our log that if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, there's no way they will allow our members to wear shorts on the network. No way in hell. Why would they agree to that? It's so minor a thing. They'll just never do it. That's now in the EA, and our members can wear shorts. So including as much as you can, as many sort of important things to your members as possible. You do have a chance, if you get the unique EA situation that we do, you will have a chance to pick those things up and lock them in forever and a day into your EA. So those tropes, I think, really came clear through this one. Holding the line was the other one. Like, there were a couple of times during the CA where I thought maybe we've hit a brick wall on this and we're just wasting everyone's time or wasting a lot of resources, and we're just not going to get there, and we should compromise. And I, at one point, actually went and spoke to Brain's Trust and Mine about this and said, what do you think? Someone who's far more experienced in negotiations than me, and we're doing a lot longer. And when I spoke to him about it, he said, just hold the line, keep going, they're going to crack. And sure enough, they did. So sticking to your strategy, I think, is the other one. We say all these things often enough, but it's not till you have a really tough EA that you actually see that those things do work.
From what I can gather from our conversation tonight, there's a nimbleness, though, to your campaign as well. I mean, obviously, you went into an unprecedented lockdown because of a global pandemic. You had to start negotiating on a new technological platform. You had to deal with that. You found new tools like WhatsApp to help communicate. You leveraged new resources that you probably didn't know you had at the start of the campaign. So there is a nimbleness. I think you're probably being a bit too bashful in terms of the successes. I think there's some stuff you should be proud of as well in terms of the way that you did modify your strategy, right?
Yeah, yeah, I'm really proud of our group. I think that's right. I think, Jane McAlevey, who's a negotiator in the US, writes a lot about big bargaining units, and she talks about having a really big kind of delegate bargaining unit. And so I sort of looked to her, because we've got 80 delegates, looked to her to, how do you manage this? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And I think the advantage of that is, you've got 80 people invested who are going to give you ideas. They're not always going to be good ideas, but some of them are going to be much better than your own ideas. And so having a big group like that, logistically difficult, but such an intellectual advantage in terms of coming up with a good strategy. So if you can afford the resources to manage it, then actually you are at an advantage in having that bigger group, because you've just got so many more people who know what's going on. Well, I think that gave us an overwhelming advantage over management, because we had 80 people every day in the room who work on site. And so they knew intimately what the pressure points were. So we would have managers talk about things and our guys would correct them because they actually do it. We can, like rostering and different, so that's just not going to work because we do it. It doesn't happen that way. Or if it comes to industrial action, they know, look, if we don't turn off electrical power this weekend, they can't construct the new metro tunnel. That's going to delay their contract with John Holland. That's $30 million in a week gone. And so we could do things like that because we just had this great resource in our members and our delegates to tell us what was going on that management doesn't have.
You name-checked Jane McAlevey. When you mentioned before, when you first said there was 80 people in the room, I immediately thought of her, and I think that that example of that campaign that they ran in a hospital with the SEIU, where they basically brought as many people into the room to negotiate.
Yeah.
The room got so big they had to go and move to like a church hall or something to have the negotiations. It's reminiscent of that.
I did have a plan at one point, like, should we just live stream the meeting so everyone could see what was happening?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get that next time. Previously, when we sort of talked about it, we didn't know how to do it with technology, but now we actually do know how to do it. I think it's the way to do it.
Indeed. Look, Thomas, can I say to you, congratulations, not just obviously the hard work that you put in yourself personally. I'm sure it must have had a massive impact on your own personal life, because I'm just trying to calculate the amount of hours that you must have dedicated to these negotiations over such a long period of time, and keeping the faith in both yourself, your own abilities, your leadership, and the work that you do as a trade unionist, but also extend that congratulations to everyone involved in the negotiations, from the union officials, but also to the delegates and the members across those 6 unions, those 16,000 workers. Just a great story. And I really do appreciate you taking your time out of, I think you're having a bit of a break at the moment to share with us this great successful campaign for the trade union movement in New South Wales.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Really appreciate being able to talk to it as well. It's been a fun conversation.
We'll have to get you back on the show later on and let us know how one went with the negotiations, but also you got a state election coming up as well in 68 days' time. So I'm sure there's plenty of other things for Unions New South Wales to do to ensure they flip a government.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that one as well.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message. perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.